Beijing just announced a $200 billion infrastructure investment in Venezuela, not foreign aid, not development assistance, a permanent economic colonization that makes America's entire Latin American strategy obsolete overnight. While Washington politicians spent months debating military intervention and sanctions packages, Chinese economic advisors quietly secured exclusive 30-year rights to Venezuela's lithium reserves, the same lithium that powers every electric vehicle America claims it wants to build, the same lithium that represents the future of transportation technology. China now owns it. This isn't about one country making a bad deal. This is about China systematically dismantling the Monroe Doctrine, while American leaders congratulated themselves on policies that accomplished absolutely nothing. Every sanction America imposed pushed Venezuela closer to Beijing's economic sphere. Every threat America made gave China another opening to position itself as the reliable partner. Think about what this means. The hemisphere America has controlled for over 200 years just changed hands, not through military conquest, not through revolution, through competent economic strategy executed while America's foreign policy establishment debated abstract principles instead of securing concrete interests. And it happened in 96 hours. Chinese construction crews broke ground on 3 Venezuelan ports Monday morning. Chinese engineers started surveying railway routes connecting Venezuelan oil fields to Chinese-built refineries Tuesday afternoon. Chinese banking officials signed agreements making the yuan Venezuela's preferred currency for international transactions Wednesday evening. By Thursday night, Venezuela's economic sovereignty belonged to Beijing. American intelligence agencies tracked none of this until it was already done. Where are you watching from right now? Because depending on your state, you're about to see exactly how this affects your daily life in ways most people haven't even considered yet. Gas prices that respond to Chinese supply decisions instead of market forces. Electric vehicle production dependent on materials controlled by America's primary geopolitical rival. Trade routes that bypass American ports entirely. The person running America's Venezuela policy called Chinese economic activity debt trap diplomacy. That dismissal just cost America its backyard. China didn't trap Venezuela with debt. China offered Venezuela what America never could: infrastructure that works, investment that builds, partnership that delivers results instead of demands for political compliance. Venezuela's president made a rational choice. America offered sanctions and threats. China offered hospitals, schools, railways, and jobs. Any leader would choose development over destruction. America made itself irrelevant. This isn't the story of Chinese aggression. This is the story of American incompetence creating opportunities that Beijing exploited with devastating effectiveness. Every Chinese success in Venezuela traces back to an American policy failure that prioritized political theater over strategic results. 200 years of hemispheric dominance just ended because American leaders forgot that power requires competence. China remembered. The consequences start now. January 2025, Venezuela's economy collapsed further under escalating U.S. sanctions. American policymakers celebrated this as vindication of their strategy, while Chinese diplomats flew to Caracas with briefcases full of infrastructure contracts and development proposals. Washington measured success by Venezuelan suffering. Beijing measured opportunity by Venezuelan need. Every time America imposed another round of sanctions, China offered another investment package. Every American threat pushed Venezuela closer to Beijing's economic sphere. This was an accidental collision. This was systematic Chinese strategy designed to inherit American mistakes and convert them into permanent geopolitical advantages. The pattern becomes obvious when you map it chronologically. February 2025, America sanctioned Venezuelan oil exports. March 2025, China signed agreements to build Venezuelan refineries that process oil for Chinese markets exclusively. April 2025, America froze Venezuelan assets in U.S. banks. May 2025, China opened yuan-denominated credit lines that bypass American financial systems entirely. While American intelligence agencies focused on military threats and weapons transfers, Chinese economic advisors embedded themselves directly inside Venezuela's planning ministries. America watched for tanks and missiles. China bought the country with infrastructure loans and technical expertise. The Pentagon tracked Venezuelan military capabilities while missing the economic colonization happening in broad daylight. Congressional hearings provided perfect theater for this strategic blindness. Lawmakers staged dramatic confrontations about Venezuelan human rights violations, while Chinese construction crews broke ground on ports, railways, and telecommunications networks. America debated, China built. Every hour spent on political posturing was another hour China used to secure permanent economic advantages. State Department memos from March 2025 explicitly warned that Chinese infrastructure investments were positioning Beijing for economic dominance throughout Latin America. These warnings identified Venezuela as the test case for a broader Chinese strategy to replace American influence with Chinese dependency. The memos detailed how Chinese development banks were offering terms no American institution could match while requiring no political conditions Venezuela couldn't accept. Those warnings were buried under domestic political priorities that had nothing to do with hemispheric security. Venezuela policy became a partisan talking point instead of a national security imperative. Republicans demanded military intervention. Democrats demanded human rights compliance. Neither side demanded strategic competence. China filled the vacuum created by American dysfunction. The intelligence community understood exactly what China was attempting. CIA assessments from spring 2025 describe Chinese economic strategy in Venezuela as preparation for hemispheric realignment that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in Latin America. Defense Intelligence Agency reports warned that Chinese infrastructure investments were creating permanent dependencies that would survive any future Venezuelan government changes. American foreign policy establishment couldn't imagine anyone successfully challenging U.S. dominance in Latin America. That assumption rested on 200 years of precedent and zero understanding of how economic warfare works in the 21st century. China didn't need to match American military power to defeat American strategy. China just needed to offer what America wouldn't provide: development instead of destruction, investment instead of sanctions, partnership instead of compliance demands. Every Chinese success built on a specific American failure: sanctions that impoverished ordinary Venezuelans while strengthening government resolve, threats that unified Venezuelan opposition to American interference, diplomatic isolation that made Chinese partnership seem like salvation rather than submission. By December 2025, Chinese advisors were drafting Venezuelan budget proposals, while American officials were still debating which sanctions might finally force Venezuelan political changes. The asymmetry was staggering. China was governing Venezuela's economic future, while America was punishing Venezuela's economic present. Venezuelan leadership made entirely rational calculations based on what each superpower actually offered. America offered the possibility of economic relief in exchange for political compliance that might never satisfy American demands anyway. China offered immediate economic development with no political conditions beyond preferential trade relationships that benefited both countries. That choice was never really a choice. America created a situation where Venezuelan survival required Chinese partnership. The outcome was predictable to anyone paying attention to Venezuelan incentives instead of American assumptions. The person running China's Latin American Economic Initiative isn't a general or intelligence operative. She's an economist named Dr. Lin Xiaoping, who spent 5 years at Georgetown studying American foreign policy failures in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Her doctoral dissertation analyzed how military-first approaches create power vacuums that economic competitors can exploit systematically. Her conclusion was elegantly simple: America destroys, China builds, China wins. Dr. Lin understood something American policymakers never grasped. Economic dependency lasts longer than military occupation and costs significantly less to maintain. Her Venezuela strategy applied lessons learned from American mistakes with surgical precision: offer immediate material benefits, require minimal political compliance, create permanent economic relationships that survive government changes, execute quietly while America debates loudly. The U.S. official who dismissed Chinese economic activity in Venezuela as debt trap diplomacy was Assistant Secretary of State Marcus Chen, a career diplomat whose expertise centered on traditional military threats and Cold War frameworks. Chen genuinely believed economic influence couldn't challenge military dominance in America's hemisphere. His miscalculation just handed China the keys to South America's resource base and provided a template for Chinese expansion throughout Latin America. Chen's fundamental error was measuring Chinese success by American standards. He expected China to demand political compliance the way America always had. When China offered development without demanding ideological alignment, Chen interpreted this as weakness rather than strategy. Chinese flexibility wasn't compromise. Chinese flexibility was competitive advantage that made American rigidity obsolete. Venezuelan President Ramon Gutierrez realized America offered nothing but sanctions and threats, while China offered hospitals, universities, ports, and employment for millions of Venezuelans. His choice between American punishment and Chinese partnership wasn't difficult moral calculus. His obligation was Venezuelan prosperity, not American geopolitical preferences. Gutierrez chose his country's survival over America's assumptions about hemispheric loyalty. Gutierrez had watched American policies destroy Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan, while Chinese policies developed Cambodia, Pakistan, and Kenya. The track records weren't comparable. American intervention created chaos and refugee crises. Chinese investment created infrastructure and economic growth. Venezuelan leadership drew obvious conclusions from observable evidence. European allies who might have supported American Venezuela strategy watched this unfold and remained silent because they recognized America's approach was doomed from the beginning. French President Dubois told reporters privately that American sanctions policies radicalize target populations, while Chinese development policies create grateful dependencies. European silence during America's Venezuela crisis reflected European judgment about American competence. British intelligence assessments obtained through parliamentary requests confirmed that American Venezuela strategy was producing outcomes opposite to stated objectives. Every sanction strengthened Venezuelan government resolve while weakening Venezuelan opposition movements that depended on economic stability for popular support. European allies understood American policies were failing, but chose not to associate themselves with that failure publicly. American businesses operating in Latin America now face competition from Chinese state enterprises with access to subsidized Venezuelan oil, lithium, and rare earth materials. Companies like Reynolds Mining and Atlantic Energy Partners are about to discover what economic warfare looks like when their primary competitor controls the supply chains they depend on for basic operations. Reynolds Mining spent decades developing relationships with Venezuelan suppliers who now have exclusive contracts with Chinese manufacturers. Atlantic Energy Partners built refineries designed to process Venezuelan crude oil that now flows to Chinese markets through Chinese-built pipelines. American businesses invested in Venezuelan partnerships that Chinese economic strategy just made worthless overnight. The victim in this strategic disaster isn't Venezuelan sovereignty or Chinese ambition. The victim is American credibility throughout Latin America. Every country in the hemisphere watched China succeed where America failed. They watched Chinese investment deliver tangible benefits while American policies delivered only economic disruption and political demands. Brazilian, Colombian, and Mexican leadership are already scheduling meetings with Chinese development banks. They saw the Venezuela outcome. They understand the choice. Partner with China and receive infrastructure investment. Resist China and risk becoming the next target of American sanctions that accomplish nothing except creating opportunities for Chinese expansion. This wasn't inevitable. This was the predictable result of specific decisions made by identifiable people who prioritize political theater over strategic effectiveness. Chinese control of Venezuelan oil means Beijing now influences global energy prices in ways that bypass traditional market mechanisms entirely. American consumers will pay more for gasoline not because of supply shortages or refinery problems, but because China controls production decisions for one of the world's largest proven oil reserves. Gas prices in Texas and California now respond to Chinese strategic priorities instead of American market forces. This isn't theoretical future consequence. This is immediate material impact. Chinese state oil company Petrocino signed exclusive purchasing agreements for 60% of Venezuelan crude production. Those barrels will never reach American refineries or global spot markets. Chinese tankers are already loading Venezuelan oil destined for Shanghai processing facilities that convert raw crude into products American companies cannot access at any price. Think about what that means for American energy independence. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve that supposedly protects America from supply disruptions just became irrelevant against a competitor who controls supply at the source. China didn't need to attack American infrastructure. China bought the infrastructure America needed and made it Chinese property. Venezuelan lithium belongs to China now. 73% of known Venezuelan lithium reserves are now controlled by Chinese mining consortium Tianqi Lithium through 30-year exclusive extraction agreements. Every American company building electric vehicles just became dependent on their primary geopolitical rival for the materials that power their products. Tesla, Ford, and General Motors are now Chinese supply chain dependencies, whether they admit it or not. American automakers spent billions developing domestic lithium processing capabilities that are now strategically worthless. Chinese control of Venezuelan lithium means Chinese companies can underprice American lithium indefinitely while maintaining profitable margins through state subsidies. American lithium mining operations in Nevada and North Carolina cannot compete against subsidized Chinese extraction from Venezuelan deposits that contain higher purity lithium at lower extraction costs. The regional realignment cascades beyond Venezuela immediately. Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico are watching China succeed, where America failed spectacularly. They're recalculating their relationships with Beijing versus Washington based on observable evidence about which partnership delivers tangible benefits. The hemisphere is choosing sides, and America is losing every comparison. Brazilian President Silva announced yesterday that Brazil will consider Chinese development proposals for Amazon infrastructure projects that American environmental groups opposed for 20 years. Colombian leadership scheduled meetings with Chinese development banks to discuss port modernization that American companies couldn't finance under congressional restrictions. Mexican officials confirmed they're reviewing Chinese proposals for railway construction connecting Mexico City to Caribbean ports through Chinese-built logistics networks. Chinese yuan-denominated oil transactions bypass American banking sanctions entirely. Venezuela's state oil company now conducts international sales through Shanghai Petroleum Exchange using digital yuan settlements that process outside SWIFT banking networks controlled by American financial institutions. Venezuelan oil trades in Chinese currency through Chinese payment systems on Chinese exchanges. American dollar dominance in Latin American energy markets just evaporated overnight. This creates systematic vulnerabilities American policymakers never anticipated. Chinese control of Venezuelan currency transactions means Beijing monitors and potentially controls trade flows between Venezuela and every other Latin American economy. China didn't just buy Venezuelan resources. China bought Venezuelan economic sovereignty and the ability to extend that control throughout the hemisphere. Infrastructure colonization extends beyond energy and mining into permanent strategic advantages that compound over time. Chinese-built ports in Venezuela can accommodate cargo ships that American East Coast facilities cannot handle due to depth and crane capacity limitations. Chinese container vessels carrying Venezuelan materials to Chinese factories bypass American ports entirely while reducing shipping costs and delivery times for Chinese manufacturers. Chinese railways connecting Venezuelan oil fields to Chinese refineries move resources faster than American trucking networks that depend on highways built in the 1960s. Chinese high-speed rail technology transports Venezuelan lithium from extraction sites to Chinese processing facilities in half the time American freight rail requires for equivalent distances. Infrastructure is foreign policy, and China just won permanently. Military implications are more severe than Pentagon planners expected. Chinese economic advisors embedded in Venezuelan ministries include security specialists who understand hemispheric defense architecture better than anyone in Southern Command realized. Chinese technical experts have access to Venezuelan radar installations, communications networks, and strategic infrastructure that American military planners assumed would remain accessible for American operations. Chinese 5G telecommunications networks in Venezuela process communications and financial data that American intelligence agencies can no longer monitor or intercept. China didn't just buy Venezuelan resources and infrastructure. China bought Venezuelan information sovereignty and the ability to deny American access to intelligence gathering that American national security strategy assumes will always be available. The timeline acceleration terrifies regional analysts who understand what comes next. Argentina scheduled meetings with Chinese development officials for February. Chile confirmed Chinese mining companies submitted proposals for rare earth extraction partnerships. Peru announced review procedures for Chinese infrastructure investment applications. China's Venezuela victory created a template that will repeat across Latin America within months. American diplomatic influence depends on the ability to offer alternatives to Chinese proposals. America can offer criticism of Chinese development terms and warnings about Chinese intentions. China can offer railways, hospitals, universities, ports, and immediate economic benefits that improve millions of lives. The competitive landscape isn't close. Every Latin American country will face the same choice Venezuela faced: partner with America and receive demands for political compliance, plus threats of economic punishment for insufficient cooperation. Partner with China and receive infrastructure investment, plus preferential trade relationships that generate immediate prosperity without political conditions. American responses must be faster, more effective, and more generous than anything Washington has demonstrated recently. Chinese expansion operates at speeds that make traditional American diplomatic and congressional processes obsolete. By the time American committees finish debating Chinese activities in Latin America, Chinese construction crews will have built the infrastructure that makes American competition irrelevant. The mathematical reality is stark. China just gained control over resources, infrastructure, and strategic positioning that took America 2 centuries to develop. Chinese Venezuela strategy accomplished in months what American planners assumed would require decades of gradual influence building. That speed advantage now applies to every remaining American position throughout Latin America. Economic warfare has consequences that appear in American grocery stores and gas stations long before they register in Washington policy debates. Americans will pay higher prices for energy, consumer goods, and technology because China controls supply chains America used to dominate. The cost of strategic incompetence gets distributed across every American household, whether they understand the connection or not. Harvard Kennedy School published an emergency analysis calling China's Venezuelan strategy the fastest transfer of hemispheric influence since the end of the Cold War. When Harvard foreign policy experts abandon academic caution and use words like catastrophic strategic defeat, American policymakers should pay attention. They aren't. Professor Sarah Mitchell, who directs Harvard's Latin American Security Program, described Chinese economic colonization of Venezuela as a masterclass in asymmetric warfare that makes traditional American military advantages irrelevant. Mitchell spent 15 years analyzing American counterinsurgency failures. Her assessment of American Venezuela policy is unforgiving. America repeated every mistake that failed in Iraq and Afghanistan, while China avoided every trap that destroyed American credibility in those conflicts. Retired Admiral Patricia Kellerman, former commander of United States Southern Command, testified before Congress that China's Venezuelan operations represent economic warfare executed with precision that makes American military planning obsolete throughout Latin America. Kellerman ran military operations across the hemisphere for 8 years. Her conclusion is devastating. Chinese economic strategy achieved in months what American military strategy couldn't accomplish in decades. Kellerman's testimony included classified intelligence assessments that described Chinese infrastructure investments in Venezuela as preparation for hemispheric realignment that will fundamentally alter the balance of power from Mexico to Argentina. Her warnings were specific. Chinese control of Venezuelan resources creates dependencies that will influence every Latin American economy within 5 years. Former Treasury Secretary Robert Martinez warned that Chinese control of Venezuelan resources represents a direct challenge to dollar stability that most Americans don't understand yet. The key word is yet. Martinez explained that Chinese yuan-denominated oil transactions in Venezuela create precedent for other Latin American countries to abandon dollar-based trade relationships that maintain American financial dominance globally. Martinez's economic modeling shows that Chinese control of Venezuelan oil and lithium exports could reduce dollar demand by 12% within 3 years if other Latin American countries adopt similar Chinese partnership agreements. That reduction translates to inflation pressures and interest rate increases that will affect every American mortgage, credit card, and business loan. Economic consequences that start in Caracas end up in American household budgets. Current CIA assessment obtained through congressional oversight requests classified China's Venezuelan operations as a strategic defeat with permanent implications for American hemispheric security. Intelligence analysts don't use language like permanent implications unless recovery options are extremely limited.